Okay, so imagine being so scandalous that selling your photograph becomes literally illegal in multiple countries, not because you committed crimes, not because you were a political dissident or a revolutionary, but because you abandoned your prince husband and 2 children to run away with a Hungarian violinist you'd known for 10 days, then started performing in music halls wearing skin-tight body stockings that showed basically everything, and the photographs of you became so popular that the Kaiser of Germany had to issue an official ban because apparently half of Berlin was collecting pictures of you like baseball cards. That's Clara Ward, American heiress, Princess of Belgium, serial bride, married 4 times by age 31, performer at the Moulin Rouge, the woman who inspired characters in Marcel Proust novels and Toulouse-Lautrec lithographs. Her life was so absurd that if you wrote it as fiction, editors would tell you to tone it down because nobody would believe it. She was born into Detroit automobile fortune, educated at the finest European finishing schools and expelled from all of them, married a prince at 17, got bored, ran away with a violinist, became a celebrity scandal, performed in music halls to support herself, married a baggage handler, then a train station manager, and died at 43, having lived approximately 7 lifetimes worth of drama and leaving behind children who barely knew her, ex-husbands who couldn't quite figure out what happened, and a chocolate cake in Budapest that's still named after her affair. Tonight we're talking about Clara Ward, the woman who treated scandal like performance art and refused to apologize for any of it. If you're watching with tired eyes and an overthinking mind, this story is for you. If you really enjoy these bedtime journeys through the wildest corners of Gilded Age history, please like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I always love knowing where these stories are keeping you company. Let's talk about the Dollar Princess, who was too scandalous for photograph. Clara Ward was born on June 17, 1873, in Detroit, Michigan, into the kind of family where having a massive fortune was the least interesting thing about them. Her money came from her grandfather, Captain Eber Brock Ward, who was Michigan's first millionaire. He'd made his fortune in iron, steel, shipping, basically all the industries that were exploding in the mid-19th century Midwest. By the time he died, he'd accumulated enough wealth to set up his descendants for generations, which should have been great. Inherited wealth, social position, unlimited opportunities. What could go wrong? Well, as it turns out, Clara also inherited something else from the Ward family, a tendency toward what people at the time delicately called madness, and what we'd probably now recognize as various untreated mental health issues, combined with the kind of impulsive behavior that comes from having unlimited money and 0 consequences. Clara's father, Eber R. Ward, note the slightly different spelling from his father, apparently even their names couldn't stay consistent, had a complicated life. His first wife had been committed to an asylum. Multiple of Clara's half-siblings from that marriage were either institutionalized or declared mentally incompetent. One of her brothers developed an inappropriate infatuation with the family's maid, then eloped with her in what must have been the talk of Detroit society for months. So Clara was growing up in a household that was wealthy, prestigious, and completely dysfunctional. Like if the Kardashians had Detroit automotive money in the 1880s, but everyone was dealing with serious, untreated psychological issues, and there was no therapy. Just send them to Europe and hope they calm down. Clara's mother, Catherine Lyon Ward, was apparently the family's attempt at stability and respectability. She tried, really tried, to control Clara, to channel her energy into acceptable upper-class young lady activities, to prevent her from becoming another Ward family scandal. Spoiler alert, she failed spectacularly, because from a very young age, Clara made it clear that she had absolutely no interest in being a proper young lady, and she had the money and determination to make that everyone else's problem. When Clara was 15, her mother made a decision that probably seemed reasonable at the time. Send Clara to Europe for a proper finishing school education. In the late 19th century, this is what wealthy American families did with their daughters. You sent them to exclusive European schools, usually in France or Switzerland, where they learned French, deportment, art, music, how to manage a household, how to be charming at dinner parties, all the skills a young woman would need to marry well and run a sophisticated home. Clara attended several of these prestigious schools. She got expelled from all of them, not for academic failure. Apparently, she was quite intelligent when she bothered to pay attention, but for behavior that the schools considered absolutely unacceptable for a young lady. At one school, she was caught hiding in a closet with a penniless student, not just talking to him, hiding with him in a closet, which in the 1880s finishing school terms was approximately equivalent to being found in bed with him. The fact that he had no money made it worse. At least if she'd been caught with someone wealthy, the school could pretend it was a potential acceptable match. But a penniless student? Scandalous. At another school, she apparently scandalized the nuns so thoroughly that they asked her to leave. What exactly she did to scandalize nuns in the 1880s is unclear from record, but given Clara's later behavior, we can probably imagine it involved some combination of inappropriate behavior, defiance of rules, and general refusal to conform to expectations. At yet another school, she escaped the grounds by commandeering a carriage, just decided she was done, took a carriage, and left. Like she was ordering an Uber, but it was 1888, and she just appropriated a horse-drawn carriage. Throughout all of this, Clara kept a diary, and one entry from this period perfectly captures her mindset. Ordinary marriage and smug respectability appall me. I'd rather marry a murderer. Let's pause on that for a moment. She's a teenager, from a wealthy family. She has every advantage. She could easily marry into another wealthy family, live a comfortable life, be respectable, and have social status. And she's writing in her diary that she'd literally rather marry a murderer than live a conventional life. This is not the mindset of someone who's going to quietly accept whatever future her family has planned for her. Also, during this period, Clara was going through money at an absolutely absurd rate. Her mother had set up an allowance, $40,000 per year, roughly $1.2 million annually in today's terms. Clara spent all of it, every year, on clothes, on travel, on whatever struck her fancy. She was also, by all accounts, extraordinarily beautiful. Contemporary descriptions talk about her striking features, her presence, the way she could command attention just by walking into a room. In an era when beauty and charm were valuable social currency, Clara had both in abundance, which should have made her an excellent candidate for the thing her mother desperately wanted, a good marriage. By the time Clara was 16, her mother was desperate to get her married before she caused any more scandals or got expelled from any more schools, or did whatever else Clara might decide to do. Catherine Ward's logic was probably something like, if Clara is married, she'll be someone else's responsibility. She'll have a husband to manage her, a household to run, children to raise. Marriage will settle her down. This is the same logic that people use when they think having a baby will fix a troubled relationship, and it works about as well. But before we talk about Prince Joseph specifically, we need to talk about the larger phenomenon Clara was part of, the dollar princess trade. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was basically an established market for marrying American heiresses to European aristocrats. It was so common, so recognized, that it had its own terminology, its own social infrastructure, its own matchmakers and go-betweens. Here's how it worked. American industrial fortunes were exploding in the Gilded Age. Railroad money, steel money, mining money, shipping money. Families were accumulating wealth faster than old European aristocracy ever had. But American money came with a problem. It didn't come with social prestige. In American society, being new money was less prestigious than being old money. And being old money in America still meant you were only a few generations removed from colonial times, which Europeans considered hilariously recent. European aristocrats had the opposite problem. They had centuries of lineage, titles, castles, social position, and diminishing fortunes. The old economic models that had sustained aristocratic families, agricultural estates, feudal dues, inherited wealth, were collapsing. Modern capitalism was making titles less economically valuable. Many aristocratic families were land-rich and cash-poor, living in castles they couldn't afford to heat, maintaining titles that came with expensive social obligations they couldn't fund. The solution: marry American heiresses to European aristocrats. American families got title, prestige, entry into exclusive European social circle, the ability to call themselves related to nobility. European aristocrats got infusions of American cash to restore their estates, pay their debts, maintain their lifestyles. The women, and it was almost always women being married off, not men, got European titles, castles, presentation at court, everything that was supposed to be glamorous and romantic about European aristocratic life. Whether they got happiness, respect, or good marriages was much more variable. Some famous dollar princess marriages actually worked out okay. Consuelo Vanderbilt married the Duke of Marlborough in 1895, a miserable marriage that eventually ended in divorce, but it produced children and lasted for years. Jenny Jerome, Winston Churchill's mother, married Lord Randolph Churchill in 1874. That marriage was apparently reasonably successful despite the usual aristocratic infidelities. Others were disasters from day one. The European husbands were often gambling addicts, alcoholics, abusive, or just completely incompatible with their American wives. The cultural differences were huge. American heiresses were raised with certain expectations about marriage and partnership that European aristocrats found baffling. European aristocrats had expectations about wifely deference and social position that American women found stifling, and the economics were complicated. The marriage contracts often stipulated how the American money would, how much the wife would have independent access to, what would happen in case of divorce. These weren't romantic love matches. They were financial arrangements with very expensive legal framework. By the 1890s, dozens of American heiresses had married European aristocrats. It was an established pattern. Mothers of wealthy daughters knew that if they wanted titles for their girls, they needed to go to Europe, make the right connections, and find appropriate matches. Clara Ward, Clara's mother, was following this playbook. Take the difficult daughter to Europe, find her a prince, get her married, hope the title and responsibilities settle her down. Enter Prince Joseph de Caraman-Chimay. Prince Joseph was Belgian nobility, not royal family, but titled aristocracy, which in Gilded Age terms was exactly what American heiress families wanted. He had a castle, Castle Chimay in Belgium, a title, Prince of Chimay, impressive lineage going back centuries, and approximately zero liquid assets. The castle needed extensive repairs. The roof leaked. The heating system was inadequate. The grounds needed maintenance. All of this required money that Prince Joseph didn't have. He also had debts, not unusual for aristocrats of his generation. Many of them lived on credit, assuming their estates would eventually generate enough income to cover debts, which increasingly they didn't. He needed an infusion of American cash to maintain his lifestyle and his properties, and he needed it quickly before his creditors became too insistent. From his perspective, Clara was ideal. She was young, 16 going on 17, beautiful by all accounts, rich, from a prominent American family. The Ward fortune was substantial enough to solve all his financial problems and fund the lifestyle he wanted to maintain. Sure, she'd been expelled from a few schools, but probably that was just high spirits. Young ladies often went through rebellious phases. She'd settle down once married, once she had real responsibilities. That's what everyone said about spirited young women. Marriage and motherhood would calm them. Prince Joseph was 28 years old, had been raised in the aristocratic tradition, understood his role as the manager of his estate and family legacy. He probably thought of Clara as a beautiful, wealthy young woman who would be grateful for the title and position he could offer her, who would embrace her role as Princess of Chimay, who would give him heirs and help him maintain his social standing. He had no idea what he was signing up for. From Clara's perspective, Prince Joseph represented freedom. Marriage meant escaping her mother's supervision, living in Europe permanently away from Detroit society's judgment, having her own household where she could make her own rules. The fact that she'd be a princess was appealing, not because Clara particularly cared about titles or aristocratic prestige, but because being a princess gave her independence and authority. She'd be running her own household, making her own decisions, living away from her family's control. The age gap, he was 28, she was barely 17, probably didn't concern her or anyone else. Large age gaps were normal in marriages of this class and era. Women married young, men married when they were established. The fact that she didn't love him probably didn't concern her either. These marriages weren't about love, they were transactions. She was getting something, freedom, a title, escape. He was getting something, money, financial stability. That was the deal. Neither of them was under any illusions about this being a romantic love match. This was business. They were married on May 20th, 1890. Clara was 16 years old, just weeks away from turning 17. Prince Joseph was 28. The wedding was lavish, American money combined with European aristocratic style, held partially in Detroit to satisfy Clara's family and American society, and then continued with celebrations in Belgium to satisfy aristocratic expectations. Hundreds of guests, elaborate gowns, extensive press coverage. Clara's dowry was substantial. The exact amount isn't specified in most sources, but it was enough to clear Prince Joseph's debts entirely and fund significant repairs to Castle Chimay, with plenty left over for ongoing expenses. Clara Ward probably thought she'd succeeded. Clara was married to a prince, had a title, and would be living in Europe as an aristocrat. Surely now she'd settle down. And then Clara moved to Belgium to become a princess. For about 5 minutes, this probably seemed like it would work out fine. And then reality set in. Here's the thing about being a princess in the 1890s Belgian aristocracy. There are rules, lots of rules. Rules about how you dress, how you behave, who you socialize with, what you do with your time, how you run your household, how you interact with villagers, how you represent your title. Everything is prescribed, formal, traditional. Clara looked at all of these rules and decided they were suggestions she would be ignoring. She threw gold coins to villagers from her carriage, not out of noblesse oblige exactly, but more like she was playing a game, making a spectacle. It's the kind of thing that sounds generous, but was probably somewhat condescending, and definitely not how aristocratic ladies were supposed to interact with the local population. She wore daring gowns to social events, low-cut, fashionable in Paris but scandalous in conservative Belgian aristocratic circles. She chain-smoked, which in the 1890s was something ladies absolutely did not do in public. She rode a bicycle around the castle grounds wearing bloomers, those baggy pants that early feminists wore, which conservatives considered basically equivalent to wearing underwear in public. She was so fashionable and so visible in Paris society that Auguste Escoffier, the famous French chef who basically invented modern haute cuisine, named dishes after her. Having a dish named after you by Escoffier was like having a viral moment on social media, except it was 1890s food instead of TikTok. Clara did have 2 children during this period, Marie Elizabeth, called Lily, and Marie Joseph. She fulfilled the aristocratic duty of producing heirs. But based on what happens later, It's pretty clear that motherhood didn't satisfy Clara's need for excitement and attention the way everyone hoped it would. Let's talk about these children for a moment because they're often footnotes in Clara's story, but they were actual human beings whose lives were profoundly affected by having Clara Ward as a mother. Marie Elizabeth, nicknamed Lily, was born first. She grew up in Castle Chimay during Clara's brief period of attempting to be a conventional princess. By all accounts, she had nurses and governesses. Clara wasn't exactly hands-on with childcare, which was normal for aristocratic mothers of the era. But there's a difference between having staff help raise your children, normal, and being fundamentally uninterested in your children, which seems to have been Clara's situation. Marie-Joseph was the younger child. Less is known about him in historical record, which is typical for younger children, especially sons who weren't heirs to major titles. Both children were very young when Clara abandoned them in 1896. Lily was probably around 5 or 6 years old. Marie-Joseph even younger, maybe 3 or 4. Imagine being that age and your mother just leaves. She doesn't die, which would be tragic, but at least comprehensible. No, she doesn't leave for a trip and comes back later. Just leaves permanently because she'd rather be with a violinist she just met than be your mother. After Clara ran away with Rigo Janshi, the children stayed with Prince Joseph. He was granted full custody in the divorce proceedings, which wasn't difficult since Clara had literally abandoned them and made no attempt to fight for custody or even visitation right. Prince Joseph remarried eventually because aristocrats needed to remarry to maintain their households and social positions. The children had a stepmother, which may have been better or worse than having Clara as a mother. At least a stepmother who was actually present might provide some stability. Clara was ordered to pay child support to Prince Joseph, which must have been galling for him. His ex-wife, who'd abandoned their children to run off with a musician, was technically wealthier than him, so he was legally entitled to financial support from her for raising the children she'd left behind. There's no record of Clara ever having a relationship with her children after she left. No visits, no letters, no attempts at reconciliation. When she died in 1916, she left them money in her will, which suggests some level of something. Guilt, obligation, a desire to provide for them financially even if she couldn't provide for them emotionally. But the fact remains, Clara chose scandal and freedom over her children. In an era when motherhood was considered women's highest calling, when abandoning your children was one of the most socially unacceptable things a woman could do, Clara did it anyway, and apparently never looked back. Modern readers might want to analyze this through various lenses. Was Clara suffering from postpartum depression that went untreated? Was she dealing with inherited mental health issues? Was she simply a narcissist who valued her own desires above everything else? Was she trapped in a system that forced women into motherhood, whether they wanted it or not? All of these might be true to varying degrees, but the impact on Lily and Marie-Joseph was the same regardless. They grew up without their mother because she chose not to be part of their lives. There were also rumours, never confirmed but widely circulated, that Clara had a relationship with King Leopold II of Belgium, who was himself infamous for being one of the most brutal colonial rulers in history. His personal rule of the Congo Free State involved atrocities that killed millions, but also for his personal life scandals. Whether the rumours about Clara were true, or just the kind of gossip that swirled around any beautiful, rebellious woman in aristocratic circles, is impossible to know now. What we do know is that when Prince Charles de Caraman-Chimay, known as Baudoir, died unexpectedly, there was malicious gossip suggesting Clara had somehow been involved. There's no evidence of this. It was just the kind of vicious rumour that people spread about women they found threatening or scandalous. But it shows how Clara's reputation had developed. She was the kind of person people could believe might be involved in scandal or intrigue, whether or not she actually was. Clara herself later described her marriage to Prince Joseph in terms that suggest she was deeply, profoundly bored. The aristocratic life, the formal dinners, the social obligations, the management of the household and estate, the seasonal movements between properties, the endless maintenance of appearances, all of it bored her to tears. She spent more and more time in Paris, away from the castle and away from Prince Joseph. She had a custom lavender automobile made. Having a car in the 1890s was like having a private jet now. Extremely expensive, very showy, absolutely impractical. She drove it recklessly through Paris streets, scandalizing pedestrians and other drivers. She had specific, bizarre breakfast preferences and apparently terrorized her kitchen staff with her demands for culinary experimentation. She was basically treating food like she was creating chaos for her own amusement, which is very on brand. At one point, she made a declaration that perfectly summarizes her attitude toward her title and position. A princess is only a woman with a dress budget. Litam. She'd looked at European aristocracy, centuries of tradition, complex social hierarchies, elaborate rules about bloodlines and titles, and proper behavior, and decided it was all just about having enough money to buy nice clothes, which is both reductive and also not entirely wrong, and definitely the kind of thing that would infuriate actual aristocrats who took their positions very seriously. By 1896, Clara was 23 years old, had been married for 6 years, had 2 children, lived in a castle, had a title, and was absolutely miserable. She wanted out. She wanted excitement, passion, freedom, anything that wasn't the tedious repetition of aristocratic life. And then she met Rigo Janci. November 1896. Clara is at a restaurant in Paris, probably escaping her aristocratic obligations and her boring husband, and there's a musician playing violin. His name is Rigo Janci, sometimes written as Rigo Janci or Janos Rigo. Spelling varies in different sources. He's Hungarian. He's Roma. He's a violinist who plays in restaurants and cafes. He's not wealthy, not titled, not from Clara's social class in any way. He's also, by all contemporary accounts, extremely attractive and an intensely passionate player. The kind of musician who doesn't just play technically well but performs with emotion and presence that makes people stop talking and pay attention. Clara was immediately, completely infatuated. This wasn't a slow-building romance. This wasn't a friendship that gradually developed into something more. This was an instant, overwhelming, reckless attraction. Within 10 days of meeting him, Clara ran away with Rigo Janci. 10 days. She abandoned her husband, her 2 young children, her title, her position, her castle, and her entire life as Princess of Chimay. She just left. Prince Joseph sent a cable that became famous in newspapers across Europe and America. Gone with a gypsy. The phrasing is deeply problematic by modern standards. Gypsy is a slur for Roma people, but it captures how shocking this was to European and American society. A princess didn't run away with a restaurant musician. That wasn't done. It wasn't even conceived of as a possibility, but Clara did it anyway. The newspapers went absolutely wild. This was November 1896, and remember, newspapers were the social media of the day. Major scandals got covered extensively, with daily updates, speculation, interviews with anyone who might have information. Clara and Rigo's elopement was front-page news for weeks. Reporters tracked their journey across Europe. They went to Egypt, apparently, trying to escape attention, but also not trying very hard because they were staying in hotels and restaurants where they'd be recognized. Clara wore elaborate clothes. Rigo played violin. They were obviously a couple, and everyone knew who they were. In Budapest, a pastry chef created a dessert in honor, or mockery, of the affair. Rigo Janci cake. A rich chocolate sponge cake with chocolate cream and apricot jam, covered in chocolate glaze. Let's talk about this cake for a moment. because it's one of the strangest legacies of Clara's scandal, and it deserves more attention than just a passing mention. The Rigo Janci cake, pronounced roughly Rigo Janci, was created in Budapest, reportedly at the Gerbeau Café, one of the most famous and elegant cafes in the city. The story goes that the pastry chef there decided to commemorate Clara and Rigo's scandalous affair by creating a dessert. The cake itself is decadent. 2 layers of dark chocolate sponge cake with a thick layer of chocolate cream filling. Some versions use chocolate buttercream, others use chocolate mousse or a custard-based cream, sometimes with a thin layer of apricot jam, adding a touch of fruity sweetness to cut through the richness. The whole thing is covered in a dark chocolate glaze that creates a smooth, glossy finish. It's extremely rich, dense, intensely chocolate, not subtle in any way, which is somehow perfect for commemorating Clara and Rigo's affair, which was also not subtle in any way. The name stuck. Rigo Janci became the official name for this type of chocolate cake in Hungary. Over 120 years later, you can still walk into cafes in Budapest and order a slice of Rigo Janci cake. It's a classic Hungarian dessert, beloved by locals and tourists alike. Most people who eat it have no idea it's named after a Hungarian violinist who ran away with an American princess in 1896. It's just this delicious chocolate cake that you eat with coffee. But the name preserves the scandal. Somewhere in the back of Hungarian culinary culture, Clara Ward's affair is still alive, still being consumed and enjoyed, still sweet and rich and slightly scandalous. It's one of the weirdest forms of cultural immortality, being forever associated with a dessert because your affair was so notorious that a pastry chef decided it deserved commemoration in chocolate. Back in Belgium, Prince Joseph initiated divorce proceedings. He was granted custody of the 2 children. Clara had abandoned them, so she had no legal standing to fight for custody even if she'd wanted to, which apparently she didn't. She was ordered to pay child support to her own ex-husband for the children she'd left behind. Under normal circumstances, this would have been financially ruinous. Clara would have been dependent on Prince Joseph's goodwill or her family's support. But Clara was technically the one with money in this marriage. Her fortune was her own, from her grandfather's legacy. Prince Joseph got the children and the title. Clara got her freedom and her money. From Clara's perspective, she'd made a great trade. She gave an interview to a newspaper where she declared, "I am done with it all. I wanted to be free." Done with what, exactly? Done with being a princess, being a mother, being a wife, being respectable, being anything other than exactly what she wanted to be in any given moment. She was 23 years old and had just blown up her entire life for a man she'd known for less than 2 weeks. Here's where Clara's story takes another turn that must have shocked everyone who knew her. After the initial scandal died down and she and Rigo were living together, Clara discovered a problem. Her family had cut her off financially. Catherine Ward, Clara's mother, was apparently done with Clara's scandals. She couldn't control Clara, but she could control Clara's money. She placed Clara's fortune under trusteeship with conditions that essentially froze Clara's access to most of her inheritance. So Clara, who'd been living on roughly $1.2 million per year, in today's terms, suddenly had very little income. Most women in her position would have either A. reconciled with their family and agreed to behave better in exchange for restored access to money, or B. lived quietly on whatever small allowance they could negotiate, accepting a reduced lifestyle as the price of their choices. Clara did neither. Instead, she became a performer. She and Rigo initially tried to settle in Paris, but they needed money. So Clara started performing in music halls and cabarets, first at places like Folies Bergère, then the Moulin Rouge, venues that were famous for risque entertainment. Her stage name was La Clo-Clo, though some sources say just La Clara. What did she perform? tableau vivant poses while wearing skin-tight body stockings that revealed essentially her entire body. Tableau vivant was a popular form of entertainment in the late 19th century, living pictures where performers would pose to recreate famous paintings or sculptures. Because they were supposedly art, performers could get away with wearing very little clothing in ways that would be scandalous in other contexts. Clara's performances pushed even those boundaries. The body stockings were flesh-coloured and left nothing to the imagination. She was essentially performing nearly naked in front of paying audiences. Let's get specific about what Clara's performances actually involved, because tableau vivant can sound more innocent than it was. Clara would pose on stage, often on a raised platform or in an elaborate set design, recreating famous artworks or classical scenes. Think Venus rising from the waves, or a Greek goddess on Mount Olympus, or some Renaissance painting of a reclining nude. The body stockings were technically clothing, but they were designed to create the illusion of nudity, flesh-toned, form-fitting, revealing every curve and contour of her body. From the audience's perspective, she might as well have been naked. She'd hold these poses for several seconds or minutes while audiences watched. Sometimes there would be multiple poses in a single performance, like a living art gallery. Sometimes there would be minimal movement, a slow turn, an arm raised, a repositioning, to show different angles. This was before modern lighting technology, so the stages would have been lit with gas lamps or early electric lights, creating dramatic shadows and highlights on her body. The whole effect would have been quite theatrical and visually striking. Between poses, there might be musical interludes, probably Rigo playing violin, since he was part of the act. Clara and Rigo were billing themselves as a package deal, the scandalous princess and the romantic musician she'd abandoned everything for. The audiences were mixed. Some were genuine art enthusiasts who appreciated the aesthetic qualities of the performances. Some were wealthy men who were there explicitly to see a beautiful woman in revealing clothing. Some were scandal seekers who wanted to see the notorious Clara Ward in person. Some were other performers, artists, bohemians who were part of Parisian nightlife culture. The Folies Bergère and Moulin Rouge were venues that attracted a mix of classes, not just aristocrats, but also middle-class people looking for entertainment, tourists, artists, anyone who could afford the admission price. Clara was performing for a much more diverse audience than she'd ever encountered as a princess in Belgian aristocratic circles. The audiences loved it. Clara's performances sold out consistently. People wanted to see her, whether because they found her beautiful, or because they were titillated by the near nudity, or because they wanted to say they'd seen the famous Scandalous princess in person. The press covered her performances extensively. Not always favourably. Many newspapers condemned her as immoral, disgraceful, a bad example for young women, but they covered her constantly, which just made her more famous. The Belgian aristocrats, understandably, were absolutely furious. Clara wasn't just scandalous in her personal life, she was making her scandal public, profitable, theatrical. She was using her title and her notoriety to sell tickets. She was performing in venues that respectable women didn't even attend as audience members, let alone work at. Prince Joseph was particularly mortified. His ex-wife, the mother of his children, the woman who'd been Princess of Chimay, was performing nearly naked in Parisian nightclubs for money, while using the notoriety of their divorce and her abandoned title to generate publicity and audience interest. He tried to get the Paris police to shut down her engagements, arguing that her performances were indecent, that she was damaging his reputation and his children's future prospects, that she shouldn't be allowed to trade on the Chimay name while behaving in such an undignified manner. The Paris police did occasionally intervene, shutting down specific shows or venues, usually after complaints from the Belgian embassy or under pressure from conservative groups. But Clara just moved to different venues. The Moulin Rouge would get raided, so she'd perform at another cabaret. That would get shut down, so she'd find another location. She was too popular, too profitable, too newsworthy to be fully suppressed. Venue owners wanted her because she brought in audiences. Audiences wanted to see her because she was famous and scandalous. The more authorities tried to shut her down, the more people wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Clara was also giving interviews to newspapers, playing up the romantic narrative of her relationship with Rigo, positioning herself as a woman who'd chosen love and freedom over stuffy aristocratic convention. She was controlling her own story, creating her own mythology. It's worth noting that this level of agency and self-promotion was unusual for women of her era. Most women in the scandal were passive victims of their circumstances or of male behavior. Clara was actively, deliberately creating and maintaining her scandal as a form of personal brand. She was monetizing her notoriety in ways that feel very modern. She basically invented being famous for being famous decades before reality TV and social media made that a standard career path. And then the photographs started. Clara's performances were photographed. The images were turned into postcards, collectible cards that people bought and traded. Clara Ward postcards became wildly popular across Europe. Think of it like this. She was essentially the first influencer, except instead of Instagram followers, she had postcard collectors. And instead of getting paid by sponsors, she was licensing her image directly to postcard manufacturers. To understand why this was such a big deal, we need to talk about postcards in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, because they were huge. Postcards were invented in the 1860s, and by the 1890s, 1900s, they were everywhere. People collected them obsessively. You could buy postcards of cities, landmarks, famous people, works of art, theatrical performances, pretty much anything visual. There were entire categories of collectible postcards, views of famous places, cards featuring popular actresses and performers, artistic cards reproducing paintings or drawings, advertising cards, novelty cards with jokes or optical illusions, and there were risque postcards, images of women in revealing clothing or suggestive poses. These existed in a legal grey area. They weren't technically pornography, which was illegal, but they were definitely pushing boundaries. They'd be sold in certain shops, collected by certain audiences, and periodically subjected to moral crusades by conservative groups trying to suppress them. Clara's postcards fell into this category, but with the added appeal of her notoriety. These weren't just images of a random beautiful woman. These were images of a woman with a story, an American heiress who'd become a European princess, then abandoned everything to run away with a violinist, then became a cabaret performer. The photographs showed her in her performance costume, the flesh-coloured body stocking, the tableau vivant poses, the theatrical staging. Some showed her with Rigo Gianchi, some showed her alone, some were studio portraits, carefully lit and composed. Some were more candid shots from performances. They sold extremely well across Europe. Men collected them, obviously, but women collected them too, sometimes as examples of scandalous behavior to condemn, sometimes as aspirational images of freedom and rebellion, sometimes just because Clara was famous and collecting famous people's images was popular. The postcards made Clara money. She licensed her image to manufacturers, taking a percentage of sales. It was a revenue stream that supplemented her performance income and whatever limited access she still had to her family fortune. And the more notorious she became, the more valuable her image became, the more postcards sold. It was a feedback loop. Scandal generated publicity, publicity generated postcard sales generated more fame generated more scandal. Too well, according to Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. In an absolutely wild move, the Kaiser, the Emperor of Germany, one of the most powerful men in Europe, issued an official ban on Clara Ward photographs within Germany. Anyone caught selling or possessing her images could be arrested and prosecuted. This is what I mean when I say her photographs became illegal. The Kaiser of Germany made it a criminal offense to have pictures of her. Let's think about this for a moment. The Kaiser of Germany, who had actual governance responsibilities and serious political concerns and was running a major European power, took time out of his schedule to issue an official ban on photographs of one scandalous American woman. Why? Officially, because the images were indecent and corrupted public morals, especially young people who might see them and get the wrong idea about appropriate behavior. Unofficially, probably because the Kaiser was embarrassed that so many German men were collecting pictures of Clara Ward, and it was becoming a visible enough phenomenon that people were talking about. German conservatives were complaining about the moral decline evidenced by citizens' fascination with a scandalous foreign woman. The Kaiser felt pressure to do something to demonstrate he took public morality seriously, so he banned her photograph. The ban meant that shopkeepers who sold Clara Ward postcards could be fined or arrested. People caught with her images could have them confiscated. It became contraband, literally illegal material that you had to hide or risk prosecution. Did this stop people from collecting her images? Of course not. If anything, it made them more desirable. Now they were forbidden, illicit, and dangerous. People smuggled them across borders. They traded them secretly. They hid them in drawers and private collections. Clara Ward postcards became the equivalent of contraband, and collectors became more determined to get them precisely because they were banned. Prince Joseph also tried to have her images confiscated wherever possible, working through Belgian diplomatic channels and his aristocratic connections. He argued that Clara was damaging his children's reputation and his family's standing, that her continued use of the Chime Association, even though they were divorced and she was no longer technically Princess of Chime, was harming his ability to maintain his social position. Various police forces across Europe periodically raided shops and confiscated Clara Ward postcards. The Belgian government pressured France to control the distribution of her images. Conservative groups organized campaigns against immoral postcards in general, often using Clara as a prime example of the kind of corrupting influence they were fighting against. Clara's response to all of this official censorship and moral outrage was magnificent in its absolute defiance. She licensed even more photographs, more provocative ones, more theatrical, more deliberately scandalous ones. She essentially said, "You want to ban my pictures? Great. Let me make sure there are so many different pictures that you can't possibly confiscate them all." She worked with photographers to create new images specifically designed to push boundaries further, more revealing poses, more theatrical staging, more explicitly leveraging her notoriety and her scandal. She was, in effect, trolling the Kaiser, Prince Joseph, conservative moralists, and everyone else who tried to suppress her. And she was making money doing it. This level of defiance and self-promotion was extraordinary for the era. Most women who became subjects of moral crusades tried to retreat from public life, to rehabilitate their reputations, to prove they weren't as bad as people said. Clara doubled down. She made herself more visible, more scandalous, more unapologetic. She gave interviews where she explicitly defended her right to profit from her own image, to make her own choices, to live her life without regard for what aristocrats or conservative moralists thought she should do. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, one of the most famous post-impressionist painters and the definitive artist of Belle Epoque Paris nightlife, created a lithograph featuring Clara. Toulouse-Lautrec was famous for his images of Moulin Rouge performers, prostitutes, cabaret singers, dancers, the people who lived and worked in Paris's entertainment districts. His artwork captured a particular moment in Parisian cultural history, the bohemian nightlife of the 1890s-1900s, the boundary between high art and low entertainment. His lithograph of Clara wasn't just a portrait, it was a commentary, a cultural document, a way of saying, This person is significant enough to be immortalized in art. Clara wasn't just a scandal anymore. She was part of the artistic and cultural landscape of Paris. She was worthy of being captured by one of the era's most important artists. She'd transcended mere notoriety and become a cultural phenomenon. The lithograph showed her in performance, capturing something essential about her presence and her defiance. Toulouse-Lautrec's style, slightly distorted, emphasizing certain features, capturing movement and personality rather than just physical appearance, made the image more than just a realistic portrait. It became iconic. That lithograph is now in art history books, in museum collections, studied by scholars of Belle Epoque art. Clara Ward, the scandalous American heiress who abandoned her children to perform in nightclubs, is now part of art history because Toulouse-Lautrec decided she was worth painting. She'd achieved a particular kind of immortality. She was too scandalous to be respectable, but too culturally significant to be forgotten. But here's the thing about running away with a passionate violinist based on 10 days of intense attraction. It turns out that's not actually a solid foundation for a long-term relationship. Who knew? Clara and Rigaud's relationship, which had started with such intensity and drama, began crumbling almost immediately. Both of them were unfaithful. Multiple sources report affairs, flirtations, and other relationships. The explosive passion that had driven them together apparently didn't translate into loyalty or commitment. They fought constantly. Hotel staff reported hearing violent quarrels, shouting, things being thrown. One report mentions Clara laughing during these fights, like she found the chaos entertaining, or at least preferable to boredom. The reality of life outside aristocratic protection was also probably different than Clara had imagined. She was performing in nightclubs to make money. She was dealing with police harassment. She was managing her own finances, her own career, her own life without the support structure that wealth and title had provided. And Rigaud, who'd been a restaurant musician when they met, was now living off Clara's money. She paid for their lifestyle, their travel, their accommodations. She was essentially supporting him while also being the famous one, the scandalous one, the one whose name sold tickets and postcards. This dynamic probably created resentment on both sides. Clara was paying for everything, but also wanted to be taken care of. Rigaud was being supported, but probably felt emasculated by his financial dependence. When Clara's mother finally placed her fortune under trusteeship, creating legal barriers to Clara accessing her inheritance, it must have made the financial pressure even more intense. They lasted 8 years. 8 tumultuous, dramatic, scandal-filled years. They finally divorced in 1904. Clara was 31 years old. Most people, having gone through a divorce from a prince, an elopement with a violinist, a career performing nearly naked in nightclubs, international scandal, and a second messy divorce, would probably take some time to regroup and reflect. Clara immediately started looking for her next husband. Clara's third husband was Joseph Riccardi. Who was Joseph Riccardi? Great question. Sources vary wildly. Some describe him as a baggage assistant at a train station. Others call him a waiter at a restaurant. Some suggest he worked at a hotel. Nobody seems entirely certain what he did for a living, but everyone agrees it was some form of service work, working class, probably making very little money. What we do know is that Clara met him, became infatuated. Apparently she had a type, and that type was men from working class background who were definitely not appropriate matches by society's standards, and married him in 1904. This marriage lasted even less time than her previous one. The details are scarce, but it apparently ended dramatically and quickly. Some sources suggest violence was involved. Others mention infidelity. Shocking, given Clara's track record. The marriage just imploded. When asked about it later, Clara's response was perfectly on brand. I cannot be alone. I am unhappy like that. I shall marry once again. Let's unpack this statement because it's incredibly revealing. Clara wasn't even pretending these marriages were about love anymore. She wasn't claiming she'd found her soulmate, or that this time would be different. She was straight up admitting that she couldn't stand being alone and would therefore keep marrying people to avoid solitude. This is the kind of emotional honesty that would make modern therapists very concerned and probably recommend intensive therapy before any additional marriages. But this was 1904, and therapy wasn't really a thing, so Clara just moved on to husband number 4. Clara's fourth and final marriage was to a man named Sino Salot, who worked as a train station manager. She kept this marriage relatively secret, probably because by this point even Clara understood that announcing, "Hey everyone, I'm getting married again," this time to a train station manager, would just invite more mockery. Very little is known about this marriage because Clara kept it quiet, and it didn't generate the same level of scandal as her previous relationship, which is almost disappointing, honestly. By Clara's standards, a relatively quiet marriage to a working-class man, she didn't publicly make a spectacle of feels anticlimactic. But by this point, mid-1900s, Clara in her early 30s, her health was starting to fail. Throughout the 1900s, 1910s, Clara continued to live extravagantly when she could, to make public appearances, to be photographed, to maintain her identity as the scandalous Clara Ward. Marcel Proust based a character on her in his famous novel sequence, In Search of Lost Time. She'd become part of the literary and cultural landscape of Belle Epoque France, a symbol of aristocratic rebellion and scandalous living. The 1960 film Can featured a character named Simone Pistache, who was reportedly inspired by Clara's performances at the Moulin Rouge. Her scandal had transcended her lifetime, becoming part of cultural memory and artistic inspiration. But the lifestyle was taking a toll. By her early 40s, Clara's health was failing. Years of stress, scandal, possibly alcohol or other substances. Sources aren't specific, but given the era and her lifestyle, it's reasonable to assume performing, traveling, emotional chaos, all of it was catching up with her. She developed pneumonia. In an era before antibiotics, pneumonia was often fatal, especially for people whose health was already compromised. Clara Ward died on December 9th, 1916. She was 43 years old. She'd been married 4 times, had 2 children she'd abandoned, had been a princess and a performer, had been banned by the Kaiser of Germany and immortalized by Toulouse-Lautrec, had inspired novels and films and a chocolate cake. She died in relative obscurity. By 1916, the world was in the middle of World War I, and a former scandalous princess dying wasn't major news anymore. Her will left money to her estranged children and, interestingly, to Joseph Riccardi, the baggage handler, waiter's 3rd husband, not to Rigo Janci, the great love who'd inspired her to abandon everything, not to Sino Salot, her 4th husband, to the 3rd one, the one nobody remembers much about. A Detroit newspaper wrote her obituary, capturing something essential about her. She'd lived exactly as she wanted, consequences be damned, and she'd never apologized for any of it. Rigo Janci outlived her by several years but died in poverty. The man who'd been famous for running away with a princess, who'd inspired a cake and international scandal, ended his life with nothing. Clara's legacy endures in strange ways. The Rigo Janci cake is still served in Budapest Cafe. Her story still gets told as a cautionary tale or an inspiration, depending on the teller's perspective. Her photographs, the ones that were once illegal, are now in historical archive. She lived fast, she died relatively young, and she made absolutely sure that everyone knew her name while she was alive. So that's the story of Clara Ward, the dollar princess who became too scandalous for photographs, who ran away with a violinist, who performed at the Moulin Rouge, who married 4 times and abandoned children and titles and respectability and everything else people told her she was supposed to care about. She was messy and complicated and probably made some genuinely terrible decisions. She hurt people, her children most of all, who grew up without their mother because she'd chosen adventure and scandal over raising them. But she was also undeniably herself. In an era when women were expected to be quiet, obedient, respectable, confined by endless rules about proper behavior, Clara looked at all of those expectations and said, "Absolutely not," and then proceeded to do whatever she wanted. She didn't apologize. She didn't conform. She didn't settle. From Detroit fortune to European princess, to cabaret performer, to serial bride to infamous scandal, she lived exactly the life she chose, even when those choices destroyed her relationships, her reputation, and eventually her health. And somewhere in Budapest, you can still order a piece of Rigo Janci cake, the chocolate dessert named after her most famous affair, and taste a little piece of Clara Ward's legendary Scandal.